Hello, this is Mr. Laudermith. Good morning, afternoon, or evening to you, as the case may be. This video is adapted from a PowerPoint put together by the late Kim Folia, an outstanding biology teacher from New York. And I wanted to share this with you because it very nicely covers the important evidence for evolution by Darwin's principle of natural selection. Remember that evolution and change over time is big idea number one in the AP Biology curriculum. The idea that the process of evolution drives the diversity and unity of life. We see that at the cellular level. We see that at the organism level. We even see that down at the genetic and molecular level. There are four important lines of evidence that support Darwin's idea of natural selection as the mechanism of evolution, and you should be familiar with all four types of evidence. The first, as you might guess, is fossil evidence. The second type is artificial selection, in other words, change over time caused by man intervention, by human intervention. The third is anatomical evidence, and the fourth is molecular or biochemical evidence. And we'll talk a little bit about all four types. The fossil record. When we look back in the fossil record, we see the remains of organisms that were alive in the past, but that are quite often extinct now, although they may have living descendants or closely related living species. Based on those fossils, we can start to put together family trees known as cladograms. We'll talk more about that. We have one here for the elephants that we know of based on the fossil record. At the bottom of that family tree, we have the oldest known fossil elephant relatives. At the very top, we have modern elephant species, including the two that are still alive today, the Asian and African elephant. We can look at similar information from the horse and its relatives. Here we have a graph that's showing millions of years ago on the x-axis and body size in kilograms on the y-axis. The earliest horse ancestor we have is the Hyracotherium, which lived, as you can see, about 60 million years ago. It was a very small organism, all the way up to the modern horse, Equus, which is still around today, and is, of course, many, many times larger, in some cases more than 10 times as big as its earliest known ancestor. All of this can be documented through the use of fossils. We can look at evolution of birds. This is the famous Archaeopteryx. Lived about 150 million years ago, that is during the era of the dinosaurs, the Mesozoic era. There's a rendering of what it looked like. You can see it has both lizard-like reptilian features, but also distinct bird features. It had feathers. Some people have called this the missing link between reptiles and birds, and it certainly does appear to be a bird ancestor, or at least one of a possible group of bird ancestors. And based on computer renderings and studies of its fossil remains, we're fairly confident that this creature could fly. How about going back even farther to the evolution of land-dwelling animals, the earliest tetrapods, organisms that walk about on four legs? Well, this was an area of evolution that was not widely understood. There weren't a great deal of fossils from that era until 2006 with the important discovery of a fossil called Tiktaalik, named after the site in Canada where it was discovered. Tiktaalik is sometimes considered a missing link from sea to land animals. It had very distinct fish-like features, including scales and fins, but its bone structure was such that it probably could move around, if not walk, at least drag itself around on land, much the way a four-legged modern animal could move on land. So here we see a transition from a swimming animal, 0 legs, to a walking animal, 4 legs. The evolution of marine mammals, what we mean is, of course, whales and their relatives, dolphins and porpoises, was another area of evolution that was not well understood for a long period of time. It was generally thought that the ancestors of whales was an animal that lived on land, a land-dwelling mammal, but where were the transitional fossils showing the change from a purely land-based species to a purely aquatic species? Well, At first, this sort of land-dwelling whale was considered a joke. There couldn't have been such an animal. Many scientists thought that whales were purely aquatic in their ancestry. Today, we know better because fossils of that ancestor, and indeed many transitions between the earliest whale ancestor and the modern whale, have since been discovered. These question marks in the family tree have been filled in. We actually see a very nice transition from a totally land-based organism, sort of dog-like in appearance, down to the modern whale, which is totally aquatic and cannot travel on land anymore. The second line of evidence is artificial selection. This is change in a species over time, but not directed by agents of nature like weather or predators, but instead by human intervention. Humans are deciding which are desirable traits, and so humans decide which individuals get to reproduce and pass on those traits to their offspring. That little plant on the left is a wild member of the mustard family. It's not a particularly edible or nutritious or a very tasty plant, but from that ancestral stock, humans have bred a whole host of modern vegetables, including Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, and different types of cabbage, all from this wild mustard ancestor, mainly by humans choosing certain features of the wild ancestor to emphasize when they were picking individuals to reproduce. The leaves, if we want bigger leaves, eventually we can breed kale. If we want bigger flowers and stems, we can breed cauliflower and broccoli. Maybe a more dramatic example are the modern breeds of dog. The American Kennel Club recognizes several dozen distinct breeds, but their ancestor, and this has been confirmed through DNA evidence, was in every case the wolf. Even for something as different from a wolf as a dachshund, you might look at that and say there's no way a wolf could be the ancestor of that dog. Well, DNA evidence does confirm that. This process of selective breeding, in Darwin's time, it was used to produce various fancy breeds of pigeon. In fact, in his famous work on the origin of species, Darwin spends several pages talking about selective breeding of pigeons because it was something the audience in his time would have been well familiar with. He said that the raw material for change, he did not know it was DNA, but the raw material was hidden within the ancestor bird. The potential for this variation was there. We can see this process of natural selection in action today through human intervention. When we spray insecticides to kill the pests that eat our crops, some of those insects will naturally contain a gene or a mutant variation of a gene, giving them resistance to the pesticide. So after an application of the insecticide, only those individuals with the gene for resistance survive. They are the ones who then get to reproduce and breed a new generation of insects, and eventually every insect in the population has the resistance gene, and it doesn't matter how many times we spray insecticide on the fields. They have the resistance, the insects don't die off. We've seen this happen with a number of insect pests around the world. Our application of insecticides is no longer effective. We have to develop newer, and in some cases more toxic pesticides to get rid of them. In terms of human health, this has affected bacterial resistance to drugs. Bacteria multiply at a rate far greater even than insects. Some of those bacteria will have a gene giving them resistance to antibiotics. In the case of in the case of bacteria, it's even worse because bacteria, some of them have the ability to exchange genes with each other, this horizontal gene transfer. Insects can't do that. They can pass on genes to their children, but not to members of the same generation as them. Bacteria, in some cases, can do that. They can actually literally physically transfer genes to other bacteria that are alive near them. This allows those bacteria with the gene for resistance to survive if a human being takes a course of antibiotics, or in some cases takes only partially a dose of antibiotics that's been prescribed. That allows those individuals with at least some resistance to survive. They will begin dividing again, and soon all the bacteria in a human or in a population of humans has resistance to the antibiotics. That's created what's known as MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, which is very serious in hospitals and medical institutes around the world. In prisons around the world, resistant tuberculosis has become a serious problem. Remember, these individuals have a resistance, not an acquired immunity. No one's giving these bugs or these bacteria a vaccine. No one's giving them an injection to make them resistant. They are either born, or in the case of bacteria, when they divide, the new bacteria have the gene for resistance, or they don't. It's not an acquired trait, it's an inherited trait. The third line of evidence was anatomical evidence. If we compare the human arm to the cat arm, to the whale flipper, to the bat wing. Now, these are structures used for very different purposes, but they are all built from the same combination of limb bones. Very different jobs, but a common ancestor bequeathed all of them the same set of wrist bones, upper arm bones, lower arm bones. If you look at the pictures here, you'll see that they all have one upper arm bone, they have two lower arm bones, and they have the same collection of wrist bones. In some cases, they are a different shape, and they can be different size and different length. And again, the entire limb is used for a different purpose, but it's all built from the same anatomical parts. We call those homologous structures. Homologous structures also exist in plants. The leaves of deciduous trees like maple, the needles of coniferous trees like pine, the leaves of succulent desert plants like aloe vera, the spines of cacti. All of these are modified leaves from an ancestor plant. So it all comes from a common ancestor, but it's now adapted to different purposes. That is a homologous structure, and it's evidence of descent from a common ancestor. Even the tendrils of these vines are modified leaves. The colored petals around flowers, too. Now, analogous structures are also evidence of evolution, but not from a common ancestor. We have here a bat, a hawk, and a dragonfly. All three are flying creatures. They all use wings to fly. So they are solving a similar problem with a similar solution. But you can't be fooled by their looks. They don't share, in the case of the insect, a very close common ancestor with the bird or the bat, which is a mammal. The insect's wings are part of its exoskeleton. In the case of the bat and the bird, the wings are modified from limb bones, part of their endoskeleton, a very different development process, not from a common ancestor. Fish. Many fish are very similar in their body shape and body structure, and so are dolphins. But again, it's because they live in a similar environment and have found a similar solution to traveling quickly through the ocean, to swimming. Having a streamlined long body shape with this kind of torpedo body, using flippers and a powerful tail. But while fish use gills to extract oxygen from water, dolphins are mammals and must breathe air just as humans do. So they don't share a close common ancestor. These are what we call analogous structures. Structures used to do the same job for the same purpose, but derived from different body parts, from different ancestry. This is evidence of what we call convergent evolution, because they are converging on a similar solution to a similar problem, but not derived from an ancestor's modifications. We see convergent evolution if we compare the mammals of Australia to the mammals of North America. The native mammals of Australia are all marsupials. The native mammals of North America, with just one exception, are placental mammals. Marsupials give birth to an underformed embryonic offspring, which then is nurtured in a pouch outside the mother's body. Placental mammals are born fully developed, and these mothers have no pouch. They care for their young after they are born, but don't nurture them in a pouch. And yet we often find that placental and marsupial mammals on these two separate continents have hit on similar solutions if they are doing similar jobs, if they have similar niches. Both continents have a gliding, we might say flying, but really gliding mammal that spends its time in trees and uses flaps of skin to help it glide from branch to branch. In North America, we call this a flying squirrel. In Australia, we call this a sugar glider. They are very similar in appearance, but they do not share a close common ancestor. The flying squirrel is a rodent and is more closely related to mice and rats. The sugar glider is a marsupial. It's more closely related to koalas and kangaroos, not closely related to rodents. No common ancestor here. This is evidence of convergence over time. Here's a chart that kind of goes over more examples of placental Australian mammals. You can see that we have mole-like animals that dig underground in both places. We have animals adapted for eating ants with these long tongues and snouts. We have arboreal monkey-like creatures. We have even predators that are cat-like and dog-like. But everything in the Australian marsupial column is a closer relative to other animals in that column than any of them are to the placental mammals, even the ones that share a similar lifestyle to them. So similar jobs if we look at these rows, but not similar ancestry. Convergent evolution of analogous characteristics. We can also see evidence of change over time in species by looking at vestigial structures. For instance, in whales, there are vestigial pelvic and leg bones. You don't see them in modern whales unless you actually examine their skeletons. They're not evident from the outside, but in the skeletons of earlier whale ancestors, they are more pronounced. Today, these remnant structures have no function in modern whales, but they did serve a purpose in the ancestor. They were once part of walking or swimming structures. So they are evidence of change over time. We also see that in fish. In many parts of the world, fish that became trapped in cave river systems where there was no light source lost their eyes, because having an eye is of no benefit and can actually be a detriment if it gets infected. If you can't see with the eye, there's no real reason to have it, and many of these fish species that live in caves have since evolved no eyes. They've lost eyes. It's become a vestigial organ. The final line of evidence is what we call molecular or biochemical evidence. Here we're looking at various vertebrate species. These are animals that have a backbone, and we're comparing their hemoglobin, the protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen. If you compare a stretch of hemoglobin from each of these species, you can count the number of different amino acids, the number of different building blocks that make up that protein. There's 146 altogether, but not every species with a backbone has exactly the same sequence of 146 amino acids in its hemoglobin. So for instance, if we compare the human to the macaque monkey, there are only 8 differences in its stretch of amino acids. But if we compare the human to the dog, there's 32 differences. Human and bird, 45 differences. Human and the lamprey, which is in some ways more closely related to fish, has 125. So most of its amino acids are different from the human. Why compare these DNA and proteins across species? Well, if you count the differences, you can find evidence of evolutionary relationships. The farther back in time 2 species separated from a common ancestor, like the lamprey and the human separated a long time ago, the more time there's been for mutations to accumulate, for differences in the amino acid chains to develop. Not surprising then that humans and lampreys show so many differences while humans and macaques show so few. Humans and macaques shared a common ancestor much more recently than did humans and lampreys. We can run similar comparisons to other genes that all vertebrates have in common, like the cytochrome C gene used in respiration in our mitochondria, and we can come to similar conclusions. We can even do this for even closely related groups like primates. We can count the number of differences and see when various primate ancestors separated from a common ancestor. Darwin hit upon this idea in his book on the origin of species. He had a diagram, it's the only one in the whole book, called the Tree of Life. He thought that you could represent these different species as branches coming off a common stem, a common ancestor, and we still draw similar diagrams today, and we will do this in class. We call them cladograms. So that is the 4 types of evidence for evolution that you should be familiar with. We'll do some more practice with each type in class. I'll finish with 2 important quotes from biologists. One of them is from Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the key figures of evolutionary biology in the 20th century. He said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. How can you explain a male peacock's enormous tail? Well, it's not very good if it's trying to hide from predators, but it's a great evolutionary adaptation for attracting mates. And if it can reproduce better by having that tail, it's an adaptation." Another towering figure in 20th century evolutionary biology was Ernst Mayr. Mayr said evolution is so overwhelmingly established that it has become irrational to call it a theory. Many scientists today would say that evolution should be treated as a law, just like the law of gravity. It's been so overwhelmingly established by evidence, both from fossils, from artificial selection experiments, anatomical evidence, biochemical evidence, that there's no reason to consider it a theory that will ever be rejected. It's been established so firmly, we should call it law. So that is the 4 types of evidence for evolution. Thank you very much.